How are you, Macylin? How are you, my darling? Please, please, please forgive me for this delay. It's never happened to this degree before. But I'm not on the air because I'm doing readings and birth charts and catching up with assignments. But and then to do your chart took a minute. It's been a long time since I've done or that someone has ever asked me to do progressions, transits, secondary progressions, and things like that. And it's quite different when it's one thing to do a birth chart, talk about your personality, talk about X, Y, and Z, right? That you all know. But it's another thing to then do a birth chart and then do predictive astrology. You see, the birth chart there's several layers to it. The birth chart that everybody buys talks about your personality, your ego, what your destiny is, and blah, blah, blah. But when you want to find out what's going to happen in the future, based on astrology, the birth chart, you have to, or the astrologer has to engage in what's called predictive astrology. And predictive astrology is to move the houses, the signs, and the planets forward. And depending on what age you want to explore, let's say you are 26 years old and you want to know what's going to happen when you're 32. We have to move all of the planets, the houses, and the signs forward. Actually, let's say we are 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. So that means that we have to move the chart 6 degrees. So if you were born with the sun in Virgo at 10 degrees, and that's the birth, then moving it 6 degrees puts it at 16 degrees, the sun in Virgo. So 1 age or 1 year equals 1 day. Or 1 year equals 1 degree. Or 1 day equals 1 degree. This is a down and dirty way of moving the chart forward. Right? Now, there's a lot of math involved in doing this because you can't move all the planets smoothly and easily 1 degree over for a year. Some of these planets are retrograde, and you have to account for the calculations of the retrograde. So if you have a planet that's retrograde, you can't use the method of moving it forward 1 degree 1 year because it's not going to move forward 1 day or year because the planet is retrograde. So you have to understand and know the motions of that planet and understand the retrogradation period, and that has a separate math to it. You have to calculate that, and then when you get the results, then you move the planet forward. But it might not be 1 degree. It might be 40 minutes, 30 minutes, 28 minutes, 59 minutes. If you round it off to 1 whole and move it, it's going to be wrong, and the prediction will not be accurate or exact. And this is especially true of the retrograde planets. If it's Mars, if it's Mercury, it's a lot simpler. But the more slower moving planets like Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn require special calculations to apply this formula and move them forward. For example, not all the planets can be moved that way. The moon moves too fast to, move it forward 1 degree 1 year. We have to do what's called another set of calculations called secondary progressions. And secondary progression can be calculated only for the moon. And it's it's a difficult mathematical equation, a difficult calculation. It takes time. I've been doing this 40 years, so it's it's not that I can eyeball and guess. But if I'm going to actually do it, because someone paid for that, then I have to actually do the specific math to get the right numbers to move the moon forward. Right? That's one thing. So we got the day for a year or the degree for a year movement. We have the second day progression movement. We have the readjustment calculation, is what they call it, for the retrograde planet, so that it can be accurate when you move the chart forward. Right? And that also includes moving the ascendant and also the midheaven. Right? Mercury, it's another planet that is very difficult to move forward with a simple equation such as the day equals a year or a degree equals a year or a day. Mercury moves 28 times faster than the moon. So the calculations for Mercury can be quite complex in moving it forward, but it can be done, and the mathematics is there to do it. So, it's a series of trial and error, because if you mess up the calculation, you can mess up the minutes, or you can mess up the seconds. The seconds can mess up your minutes, and the minute can mess up your degree. It's like pennies. Pennies will affect your coins, and then your coins will affect the dollar. So it's the same kind of concept, the same kind of principle, and it takes a little time. I'm doing 2 progression charts this week and the ending of last week, okay? And they have to be done perfectly, no room for error, or the prediction will be wrong. Right? So that, and of course, you do have softwares for free online. AstroTheme, Cafe Astrology, they have all this. Of course, many of you are not going to understand that, because it's really for the professional astrologer to calculate for you. But I'm very happy and impressed that these free websites that do birth chart wheels, they do have that there, and you can look at it, put in your number, put the date that you want to move the chart forward, and it will calculate the chart for you. But you might not understand it, or not understand the concept behind it and what's going on. The birth chart is not a static symbol. It's not a static symbol. It's not like you got a birth chart, right? And that's it. No, everything that it has in there is tried and true. But it's more than that. It also lets you know when events are going to occur, when things are going to occur in the future. You can also move the chart backwards. Let's say you experienced trauma, and you want to know what the trauma was. The natal birth chart will depict what the trauma is. But let's say you want to find out because you've been resolving this now, let's say you're in your 30s to 40s. You don't have any memory of what occurred to you when you were young. So let's say you want to go back to age 9 or age 7, and you're like in your 50s. You have to move the chart backwards the number of degrees that you are in age now. So if you're 56 and you want to find out what happened at 7, you have to move the birth chart 50 degrees backwards. Now each house has 30 degrees, right? 12 times 30 is 360. The houses got 30 degrees. So if you're talking about 50 degrees or over, then you're going to be crossing 2 houses. One whole house, which is 30 degrees, and then the next house, which will be 20. 20 and 30 is 50. So when you were 7 years old, those planets were at those degrees and were in different houses. Now this is reflective, though, of the birth chart. The closer you get to being almost 2 years old, 1 year old, going backwards, you're going to see that the whole birth chart is going to resemble the actual natal chart in which you were born. So it's a system that actually checks and balances itself. Now, I just mentioned a few predictive tools of moving the chart forward. There's another series of cycles that the planets have that have nothing to do with moving them forward or backwards. But each of the planets in our solar system has a cycle of their own. That has to be taken into accountability also. For example, Venus has an 8-year cycle, meaning that the planet Venus goes around the wheel and hits all the signs in 80 years. Jupiter has a cycle of 12 years. It goes around the wheel in 12 years, going to each side. Saturn has a 2.5-year cycle, a 7-year cycle, and a 30-year cycle. Uranus has a 9-year cycle. Pluto has a 248-year cycle, and we are not going to be alive to witness Pluto move at all. Not even 1 degree. You could have Pluto in your chart, and you'll be almost 90 years old. And the Pluto, instead of moving in degrees, is moving in minutes. So it might take 30 years for Pluto to move into 1 degree from another, because it is a very slow moving planet. And its cycle is 248 years. Neptune is 176. Uranus is 84 years. But we break it down by each sign by 12. And those are the amount of years that it will spend on the sign or the house. So that's another series of calculations. And then you have the daily transits. That's another calculation and another predictive tool. So we're looking at maybe possibly 7 different ways to predict events according to the movement of the birth chart. Some astrologers will use 1 or 2, at the most 3. And many astrologers don't do all the calculations because, it's a lot of money. Usually the well-to-do can afford that, because one birth chart to do this will take about 3 days to prepare that, right? And that's just doing the mathematics of it. Then the astrologer has to sit and analyze these new aspects that are being made by moving the planets forward or backward. They're going to create aspects, new aspects. And these new aspects will be telling exactly what took place in the year in question. It doesn't override the aspects of the birth. It actually activates these aspects by the movement of the planets around the heavens, and also by symbolically moving the chart forward or backwards. You get a general feel of what's coming. That's my favorite one is really the secondary progressive moon. Very telling. But then here is another calculation that has to be taken into account that can actually override them all, and that is the Saturn return. The Saturn return cycle, which occurs every 29.5 years, is its own separate entity. Its own separate, it's funny, it's just totally different. If you were to look at a scientific book of the planets and you look at Saturn has 67 moons, and it almost and it could be bright like the sun because of the rings bouncing the light. It seems that the planet Saturn can be its own solar system. It can be its own, it can sustain itself without the sun and all the other planets. And it's very interesting that even the planet out in space reflects this type of self-sufficiency and morphology. We have that same concept when we're dealing with human behavior and also celestial events, things that occur on the earth. For example, nature. Nature is also affected by the movements of the planets. The animals, the squirrels, there are certain flowers that won't sprout until the moon is at a particular quarter. There are some flowers, and I remember what they were. They're called 4 o'clocks. Look it up. 4 o'clocks. That's the name of the flower. I kid you not. When it's 4 o'clock, it opens. In the United States. But if we take that same flower and look at it from another country where the planetary energies that are pertinent to the United States are not going to be found in those countries, that flower might not open at 4 o'clock. It might open at 12 noon. It might open at 6 in the morning, depending on when those planets get there to actually affect the change. Now, many scientists don't understand why certain planets react this way to planetary energy because they don't believe that the planets are actually doing that. So, but they don't have an explanation as to why. The Indian pipe, which is another plant which kills and is predatory from its roots, seems to move according to the cycles of the moon. So, if we see this phenomenon in nature, then that means that it also is evident in the human species and the animal kingdom. The thing is that there's no empirical formula to try to figure this out scientifically. But esoterically, when we're dealing with astrology, we find the actual smoking gun, I should say, about how the actual mechanism of how this works. Right? So Macylin, she's at the tail end of her Saturn return cycle. And Saturn, of course, is leaving the planetary, well, actually the sign and house in which it's in. I'm not going to go too much into details about it. I would talk to Ms. Macylin, on the phone, or we're going to make an arrangement to speak to her and give her the specific details about it. But let's look at the ascendant, because the ascendant has to be moved as well, and the 10th house. Right? So if you have, let's say, in her chart, whoop. Okay, right here. This is the chart right here. Okay. In here, let me choose the ascendant. We have Sagittarius on the ascendant. Okay, Sagittarius on the ascendant, because she's at the tail end of the Saturn return cycle, 33. We move the ascendant. We move the ascendant from its position at 7 degrees, and that is the house cuff. We move it forward to 29 or 33. And the new aspect will tell us how the natal aspect will play itself out. It's a little complex to grab together, because technically what I'm saying is these are aspects here. These aspects are dormant. They're dormant. But when you start, and this occurs by age 4, the chart starts to move. I mean, it happens immediately after birth, but no aspects are being made because you're still a baby child. When the actual key year in which the chart now can become relevant and significant and analyzing the natal aspect is age 7. It begins in consciousness at 2.5 years old, which is the moon, and then it culminates at 7 years, which is another cycle of Saturn. Because by that time, the ego of the native is formed. The ego is still not quite formed at 2.5 years old. It begins to take solidification at 4 and maximization at 7. At 7 years old, that child knows who he is, and he knows that he's not attached to the parents, and he knows that he's a separate being from the parents, things like that. Right? It doesn't offset or dismiss natural or human development. It actually parallels it. And that's what's genius about this, that it doesn't contradict human development. It actually goes in parallel with it. And so when we do, let's say, look at the chart and move it forward, and we see new aspects being formed, understand that it's not overriding the natal aspects of the chart. It's actually letting you know how we are going to play out the natal aspects that are now being activated by the movements of the planets or moving the chart forward. Now, when we move it backwards, we call this converse direction. Converse direction is moving the planets and the signs and the houses backwards, to go backwards in time, to find out information that's pertinent to the client. But this type of movement is more investigative astrology rather than predictive astrology. There's a difference. So here we're doing predictive astrology. The person wants to know what their career should be, what their destiny should be, and does the chart have that information? And when can the person begin to prepare to move towards that destiny? That's also explainable in the birth chart. So with the Sagittarius ascendant being moved to age 33, I can find out how these natal aspects that are already there are going to be played out. Because an example, let's say we got the sun square the moon. The sun square the moon is a very difficult aspect, and when we're dealing with the sun, we're dealing with the father, and the moon is the mother. So you don't know how this square will play itself out. You're too young to understand what's happening to you if this is going to be applied to you. And if it's not, and it usually doesn't, you know. But guess who lived this square for you? Your parents. So whatever you're supposed to go through that you're too young to experience, it will happen through the agency of your parents, who are going to personify the square. How is this going to happen? There could be conflict between your mother and your father, constantly fighting, not getting along. Usually with the square to the moon and the sun, and also the opposition, there is separation or divorce. The square to the moon from the sun might become activated by age 2, by age 4, or age 17. Moving the chart forward will let me know when. It will also let me know when your parents divorced, your parents separated, or maybe one of them died. This is very symbolic of the square and the opposition. But there's other manifestations of human behavior that is also pertinent to the square and the opposition. Let's say it's not your parents. It could be the environment. Or it could be some other form of event that will represent this square. You're not going to know it unless, and the astrologer is not going to know either, until he moves the chart forward to see what's going on, what took place, and how this aspect actually expresses itself in human events. Okay? Because there are books written about these aspects. The question is, which aspect is going to actually play itself out? And at what duration or cycle? And this is something that has to be calculated by the astrologer. It's, I find it exciting, well, I like math, right? But it can be tedious, time consuming. And this is another reason why, in the 80s, when I was a student of astrology, people will ask for birth charts, and they will ask for secondary progression, solar arcs, and it would be a lot of money. A lot of money. Remember, there was no computers and internet, and so everything had to be done by hand. But that's a good way to learn, though. It's a good education. Because you guys know that I've been going through issues with my computers and technology. Thank God that I learned this craft professionally, because I can always go back to the old way and get a pencil and paper and a calculator and do it from scratch. And sometimes that's even better, because you stay connected to the planet, to the movement of the stars. Now, there's a harmony and a synchronicity that, as the astrologer, we experience when we're doing other people's birth chart. And it really is almost like a symphony. The cycles of Saturn, which is 2.5 years, right along with the moon, and 7 years. Even though the moon doesn't have a 7-year cycle, it does have 7 major phases, which again symbolizes and mirrors the energy of Saturn, or the energy of Saturn. And then you have the 29.5-year cycle. The 29.5-year cycle is also quite telling, because when planets move by the angles, they're causing a square. You may not be born with a natal square, but the movement of the planet eventually will cause a square somewhere in the chart. And it may activate the already existing squares or aspects that are there from birth. Okay, this is called activation. This is why it takes a little longer to do, but because it's mathematical and it's exact, it really does, in a very dramatic way, spell out what should be happening and why and when. Okay? The major planets that are of noteworthy significance will be Saturn and the Moon. But let's say you have issues concerning a relationship, or you want a relationship, or there's problems with your boyfriend, lover, or you're on the brink of divorce, you're trying to fix a situation, you look to the planet Venus, which was marriage, commitment. Venus will be fine, naturally, but then all of a sudden, you want a divorce from your husband, or girlfriend, or wife. So we look at the birth chart. Now we see a difficult transit to Venus, causing a major difficult aspect that can disrupt the harmony of marriage or even money, because Venus rules these things. I know people who have had devastating divorces or separation, and when I look at the chart, what's afflicted in the birth chart? The planet Venus. She's not afflicted in the birth chart, but she becomes afflicted during the transit at some point when the person becomes older. And this is true of any aspect or field of life related to the planets. Now, the real player here is the transit and the movement of the planets. They're not just going to move out in the heavens and not cause any aspects on Earth. They do. And it will always be indicative of what is promised in the birth chart. So if Venus is very difficultly aspected natally in the birth chart, there are going to be aspects that are going to be reflective in the transit that's going to play that out. Okay?